a code perspective, but from a what it can do and what it says about what we all can do with source code. Additionally, I was just in Paris with my wife, and Asterix was everywhere. I mean, it was like in every business, every home. It was that's me. They even have a park dedicated to the cartoon character that this whole conference is about. I mean, I can't tell you how important this little Gaul, born in 85 BC, is to. Oh, sorry. So this is Mark. This is not that. Oh, you're not seeing that? No. Oh, you're killing me here. It's like I had this great joke and everything. One moment. It's a little embarrassed. Are you seeing anything now? There you go. All right. So pretend like I was just being very clever. I was like, why isn't Mark coming up? So it's a different Asterix. Okay. Well, let's keep going. So Astralis is a UK ambient dub band that has been featured in Ibiza and not that one either. No. Okay. Sorry. Let me keep going. The Astral Pinus is the most famous purple flower that's ever been made. Well, grown. It usually grows along. No, not that one. The tremor in the hand that comes from a buildup of ammonia during renal failure. No. Okay. The satellite. No, this is the one that goes on the network and does the phone thing, right? Yeah. Right. Okay. I got it. And you're like into planes, so you're talking about the air traffic control system. It can be routed over TCP/IP, No? No, not that one? Okay. So I think this, is it the symbol? It's closer. Now what's funny is my favorite one down here is the asterism, which is the passage break. It's not used in typography anymore. But these are all technically asterisks, including the 8-pointed one. They all have different meanings, and it's actually kind of interesting, but it's not this either. So I'll stop. I won't go on and tell you about the liturgical star cover or the unofficial constellations that are as legitimate as, say, the constellations Virgo and the rest, but are not as well defined, or the junk DNA. So I obviously really am just kidding around. Back in 2005, I said this: Asterix represents a project that is on the verge of being too important to be vulnerable. I was being asked about the then SCO litigation around Linux. And what I was saying then was that Linux was too strong and too important to the world to be vulnerable to the attacks of trolls like SCO. And people were like, well, who else do you think is like that? And honestly, I said, I think that Asterix is. I think it's too late for Asterix to be vulnerable to the kinds of people who would attack it, the way that SCO has attacked Linux. And if you haven't tried it, you should. And that was April of 2005, about 5 years ago. 4.5 years ago. My daughter, if you screw up the halves, she's like, no, Dad, I'm 8.5. And it's like, okay. But in a strange way, I'm not really here to talk about Asterix, except for as a specific example of what I've based my whole career around, which is open source. And so I'm going to use the asterism to indicate that we're making a little break. And what I wanted to talk to you about is really the power of open source software. And you were talking about how in 2004 those people brought together the FOP, the Flash Operator Program, right? Panel. And how basically they said, well, we've got this great Asterix code, let's add this code and we'll get what we want from it. And that sort of ability to tie things together, to make more out of our projects and out of our source code than just what maybe the original author created or even intended, is fairly remarkable. And it represents some fairly amazing work. Now in my job at Google, and I'm not actually going to talk much about Google. You guys probably are familiar with what Google is, and we've released a ton of source code, about 20 million lines of code. And it's the least we can do in some ways, is to do that. Things like the Summer of Code, things like our software release, because we use so much of open source at Google. And it's so important to us. But as part of that work, we really want to know how open source is doing from year to year, how it's changing, and where it's going. And because people being able to do things like add stuff to stuff changes the entire industry. I mean, Astrix represents, in a lot of ways, the great equalizer. It's the Colt 45 of PBXs, right? It's like you're either going to be good or, basically Astrix has already eaten your lunch. And they're just going to come in and wipe the floor with you. So you have to compete with a really terrific way of doing, in the case of Astrix, a PBX and phone conversations and all this cool stuff. So open source helps level the computer industry. And not level like in the post-apocalyptic level sort of way, although some people have said that. And they've called us a cancer and communists and socialists and all that stuff. But it has acted to create, and this is why Google loves it so much, by the way, to create a fair place for us all to compete, to work together, and to do so in a fairly frictionless way. One of the best things about open source from a corporate perspective, from a big Google company perspective, is when we want to work with an outside group, what we'll do, 7 times out of 10, is we'll say, listen, why don't we just fund your work and you release it as open source? Because then we can use it very readily. You can keep on using it. We don't really care about the copyright because it's all dictated in the license. And that ability to create those sort of frictionless workspaces between organizations instantly, because we all understand the licenses together, it makes for remarkable productivity. And honestly, it saves a huge amount of time. So the average amount of time, by the way, to create an agreement between a company like Google or even a company like Digium and, say, a university for doing joint development, or between 2 companies, can be measured in 3 to 9 months. I had one deal, actually, with the Free Software Foundation. Basically, we were doing the blanket permission between Google and the Free Software Foundation so the Googlers could patch. That took 2.5 years. And it wasn't because Richard was difficult or anything like that, but because basically it was just back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And what I found out later was that's about a year less than it normally takes. So it took Cisco longer. Anyway, the whole talk about this talk is actually not about any one in particular project, though. It's about what we learned about open source. So what do? Google, it turns out, crawls the web. We spider and index, and we download a lot of web pages. One of the things that's on the web are all these forges, which, by the way, I have to say, it cracks me up because I'm like, oh, I have code inside GForge, wow. So it's kind of neat, that there's some vestigial code in there from me. I don't want to talk about that. That'll bore the hell out of you. But as we crawl the web, we do some pretty interesting things. We both ignore and not ignore web pages. Okay? We used to ignore source code. We said, well, you know what, that's not really what we're good at yet. And then a fellow by the name of Russ Cox, who was an intern, he said, we could do code search. And Russ Cox is one of these people, he's absurd. He says, I think I'll just, make my own nuclear reactor in my basement today, And so during his internship, he basically created this entire system for crawling, doing regex across, terabytes of data, and he's an amazing engineer. We joke that he's our first Turing Award winner that started at Google before he got one, because he's so smart. But so he wrote the code search product over his summer internship 3 or 4 years ago. And so we started having these very large databases of code. And it's grown over time, and it's classified and categorized by license. And we said, well, why don't we actually do some introspective research into this data that really no one has, So the first thing we did is we took it through a uniquing process, where we said, okay, per project, unique files. How much code is there really? How often is it used? And what we found currently with the size of our crawl, which is not by any means exhaustive, is that there's about 31 million unique files in open source software, amounting to about, this is a little low, but it's really about 3.2 billion unique lines of open source code that's out there. And that's spread across a number of languages. One of the things I did at a previous conference was I asked him, what do you think there's more of, PHP or Perl and stuff? We can do that later if we want and we have time. But anyway, so we took the knowledge that we gained from looking at the 3 billion lines of code, and we compared it against what we know from things like code.google.com that now hosts a little over 240,000 projects, SourceForge with its many hundreds of thousands of projects, and we said, okay, what can we learn from this? Now, the immediate question is, how can you trust this data? Can you trust this data? And it's pretty good data as far as such things go. It's based on a large enough corpus that I'm comfortable talking about it in public. But things change from year to year, both in how we do the crawl, but more importantly, how all of you develop. Over the last year and a half, you've seen the rise of something called GitHub, which raise your hand if you know what GitHub is. It's a website. You can do code on it, but it really encourages forking and cloning of repositories. So the problem with that, from a sort of librarian's point of view, is you have a lot of copies of the same thing. So how do you ensure that you're looking at the same thing? We also had some very large code bases released, as we always do every year. For instance, Android is about 1 gigabyte of code. And when a manufacturer or a hobby group or just an enthusiast decides to clone a copy of the 133 repositories that represents Android, well, that's an additional 20 million lines of code right there. So you can very rapidly, from the one release of Android, see another, quarter billion lines of code, depending on how you count things. So we try to be very, very careful. And also, projects move around. Not very often. It's actually extremely rare for a project to move. So you should expect your Forge to take 2 years to populate with existing projects, by the way. It takes a long time for projects to make the decision to go from, say, where they're hosting now to another place. And we saw that with code.google.com. We saw that at SourceForge back in the day. That's just a number. It's almost infallible, that number. It's almost papal or whatever. Papal infallibility? Whatever. So people move slowly, but they do move. And so how do you reconcile? And how do you reconcile when a project is synced? So for instance, Perl syncs into code.google.com as backup, which we're happy to have them do. And so what does it mean when projects move around? So, and how do you get information about licenses? So I care a ton about licenses. This is my whole job, believe it or not, is this chart. And it's been my whole job for 15. In fact, if you memorize this chart, you'll know more than most of the people who say they're open source enthusiasts or open source compliance people. This is a really important chart. And this is reflected across code as well as the crawl. So what you're looking at here, the blue, for instance, God, it's hard to, okay. So this is GPL v3. GPL v3 came out 1.5 years ago, and it's already about half of all GPL projects have converted. So that's an incredible number, okay? GPL v3 is a new license, but it is, the successor to GPL v2. So we expected it to be popular, but nobody expected it to move that fast. So when you look at GPL v2 and v3 together, they amount to just under around 40%. So that's on code.google.com, where there's more Apache projects than normal. If you look at the web itself, those 31 million files, what you see very quickly is it's 49% GPL, both flavors of the GPL. Now that number has not changed in 12 years. If you were to ask me this 12 years ago with what I knew then, I would say it's about 47%. And it's floated between 47 and 51% for the last 12 years of all the open source code out there. This has never changed. So in some ways, my job is a very consistent one, right? And additionally, the LGPL, if anything, has been slowly declining. If you look over the last 12, 13 years, the LGPL started at around 24%, and now it's around 22%. But still, if you had asked me 15 years ago, 12 years ago, how much LGPL, and I said there's about a quarter of it, I wouldn't be lying to you. Now, what's interesting about this is that suppose you don't like the GPL. You're here at Astricon, so obviously you're comfortable with it, and that's great. A lot of audiences I talk to don't understand it, don't want to understand it, and are afraid of it, even today. So, put the chart back up. So suppose you're afraid of it, and suppose you're afraid of the LGPL, which is in some ways a harder license to be compliant with because it's very misunderstood. But I could talk about that for 20 minutes, and then you'd all just leave. So suppose you just want the permissive licenses. You're still talking about 700 million lines of code out there across a great variety of languages. And that's all stuff that you can incorporate, by the way, into Asterix, into GPL projects. So you get into this world very, very quickly where you have this terrific movement between projects, between licenses. And it's actually a very rare project that encourages that and notices that and manages that well. Because people tend to get license provincial very, very quickly. And they don't manage the movement of code between licenses very well. But there's this huge realm of code out there for you to use. Whether through third-party directories or whatever. So the nice thing is, as users, though, you have even more leeway than the producers of software. There's nothing to stop any of you from saying, well, I'm going to take this from Asterix, I'm going to take this from FOP, and I'm going to put it together like this. I'm going to touch it, I hope you don't mind. Like this wire-wrapped board where they basically did in hardware what so many people do in software. They say, well, I really want this Xilinx to work with this DSP. That's a DSP, right? No? It's not. What's that? A line framer. Wow. A line framer. That's, sometimes in this business you're like, you are the total neophyte, right? And so you really hear, what is that? It's a mrah, mrah, mrah. What's that? Ginger? Like in the Far Side cartoon,